Okay, good evening everybody, welcome to Blackwell. My name is Gavin McDougall from Luath Press, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the launch of St Kilda, the Silent Islands by Alex Boyd. So tonight we have Alex, who's an artist, photographer, and many things besides, and Kevin Grant, now with Historic Environment Scotland, previously with the National Trust for Scotland. And Kevin is one of the few people to have spent a considerable period of time on St Kilda, 3 years I think. So he's going to be talking in conversation with Alex. And what this book does, as well as having amazing images, it's also very much a celebration of St Kilda today and its history. So Alex Boyd.
So tonight, we're just going to talk about St Kilda and our experiences of it. Shall I talk about how we first met, actually?
Yeah. Might be a good idea.
Okay, cool. When I first went to St Kilda, I probably had a different perception of the island to many people. I'm the son of a Royal Artilleryman, my father who's here, and St Kilda to me was always in my mind sort of a military base, which is perhaps a bit different to the UNESCO World Heritage Site, double World UNESCO Heritage Site. And between that and a family, my great uncle who went out there and helped actually clear the houses after the evacuation, I've had this kind of familial link to it, and I've always wanted to go out there and explore it. So I think it was in 2013 that I went out there first time, and I arrived in Village Bay. It's quite a long trip out there. Kevin normally gets the helicopter. Yep. I got the boat. But it's interesting because it's on the horizon and it feels like it takes forever to get there, especially when the boat's quite bumpy. But I arrived in Village Bay and on Hurta, and I was expecting the military base, of course, but what I wasn't expecting was a throng of activity, really. And when I first arrived there was a number of Kinetic, not the MOD. A lot of military research staff turned up in jeeps and so on. And there was the hum of the large generator, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And I don't know how many tourists. I think a tour ship had just gone. And the first person I met on St Kilda was a man in a loud Hawaiian shirt, an artist called John McLeod, who was the artist in residence there. So it was already quite a surreal experience. And as I was arriving, I think some helicopters were coming in for some weapons testing. So already it was the idea of the 1930s evacuation was not topmost in my mind. So the first time I went there, I went on a day trip like many of you, and I thought, it's so expensive to get here and I never know when I might get back again. So I literally went on this, I'm quite, amongst my friends, I'm known for being kind of slightly mad with hill walking. So I just went on this feverish slog, taking a camera with me and dragging it up all the major ridges around Village Bay, up the back towards the Broad Bay, and then straight down just in time to get the ferry back. So it's quite a feat, challenge, but I did it. And I, believe it or not, got sunstroke because I've been working so hard. But that's not what you kind of expect to St Kilda, I suppose. No.
Although 3 years I was there, it was like the land of eternal sunshine. I had an incredible tan. We're asking me where I've been on my holidays. But it's just changeable. The year after I left was one of the rainiest on season, so I did quite well there.
Yeah, when you're there, you kind of, the first thing that greets you really in Village Bay is the military base. It's kind of omnipresent. And it's crumbling, or it was crumbling when I first arrived there. The remains of the kind of 1960s Cold War architecture is kind of falling apart. And on the beautiful days, you're like, well, it doesn't seem so bad here. But then you notice these huge concrete, just concrete weights to keep the roofs down.
Yeah. So they had to put a chain across the roof with a concrete 2-ton weight on each side to hold the roof down because it had started to come off whenever there was a reasonable bit of wind. Yeah, the building is in dire need of renovation.
Yeah, and that's the thing, it's that kind of Cold War archaeology is something that quite interests you. And since starting this book, some of those buildings are actually gone now.
Yes.
There's
an image of the dearly departed Gym Hall, which actually just blew to bits in a severe storm 2 or 3 years ago. So one of my jobs as a St Kilda archaeologist actually was to write a statement of significance for the Gym Hall prior to it blowing away, because they were considered they were considering demolishing it. So the National Trust actually gets to say whether the MOD would be allowed to demolish this building. And like any other building on St Kilda, we have to assess its significance. And it was actually very interesting to start to think about who are the people to whom that building is significant, and it's really military staff from the 1970s who used it for volleyball and that sort of thing. And architecturally, actually, it was quite an unusual building because it was an earlier generation Romney hut, of which very few survive. But the decision was taken from our hands by a storm anyway. My statement of significance is on record, so that worked out quite well, really.
I think I've read somewhere, I don't know if it's true, but the Ablutions Block, which is a lovely Victorian kind of title, was that the only listed building, or prior to? Supposedly
at one point the Ablutions Block is literally a toilet. It was the officers' toilet, which is still there. Any of you who've been to St Kilda probably used it. It's a small square squat building. It's actually the only building that remains of the original construction of the base from the first generation.
Yes.
And it's outside of the schedule area, which is the legally protected area. But due to a weird quirk, it actually was listed at one point because they didn't really know what to do with it. So it was the only listed building in St Kilda, but no more. And its continuing existence is also under threat. Interesting.
Oh no, okay. Well, it's been interesting going there because in the process of photographing Village Bay, I was very interested in the military kind of presence there and how they have these huge radar installations, which even informed me these huge kind of bunkers are almost completely empty now. They just got like someone in a laptop.
Yes,
and then, so that kind of technology has moved on. But in the process of writing the captions for the book, you corrected me quite a lot of times actually, because I'd made these terrible assumptions that it was kind of a story that the Ministry of Defence were kind of threatened Village Bay when they first moved in there after the evacuation.
There's a very potent myth that when the MOD were planning to build the base on the island, that they'd originally planned to demolish the village and use that for hardcore to build the road. But that's enormously untrue. And actually, the way that the MOD came to existence was in partnership with the National Trust, and the two work very closely together. But there's been a persistent attempt to paint the MOD as villains in the story, and so this story actually continues to reappear, even though the archival material is publicly available, where you can see that they clearly valued the buildings and all that. But that's an interesting example of one kind of perception of the MOD, and it's also why I wouldn't say corrected. I enhanced
the text with your
because the problem with St Kilda is not mystery. It's actually probably one of the most written about places on earth, given that it's smaller than Heathrow Airport. But the problem is a proliferation of myth, of incorrect assumptions, and it's actually trying to find the very small number of publications which are actually quite reliable. And so you could write an enormous book about St Kilda based on scholarly works and still be completely wrong. So it's a very challenging place to write about.
Yes, it's only having put the book together, there's a few locations that I didn't really touch upon, such as the Amazon's house, which again is kind of like Lady Grange's accommodation. Also did not include that in the book either. I mean, these are kind of places which I'm not sure if this is correct or not, but the Lady Grange, obviously a real person, obviously exiled to St Kilda by a jealous husband, I believe.
Yes, yes, there it goes.
But the Amazon's house, which is that Bronze Age structure?
Well, this is another really nice example. It's generally written about as an ancient structure. It was called the Amazon's house by the Gaelic-speaking traveller Martin in the 1690s. It's a kind of poor translation of a Gaelic term, and it's perceived to be a very ancient and unusual building, and was actually legally protected as such. But actually, it's a much later shieling hut of the kinds you actually would see in use in places like Luath into the 20th century. But traditionally, when archaeologists view St Kilda, they don't look somewhere like Luath or the Eustes for their examples. They look to Easter Island, literally, on one occasion. So there's a long history there of things being misidentified because of people's desire to make it more exotic. So the Amazon's house actually is a much later structure than most of the books would have, but despite that, it's one of great significance, and is probably quite early for a shieling hut and is well preserved.
I think, you've spoken about this kind of more remote places. I think Kathleen Jamie's touched on that as well, like somewhere like North Rona is perhaps more remote than St Kilda.
Significantly more.
They don't have cruise ships there, discharging I don't know how many people there in the summer. But I've just spent the last 2 years living on the Isle of Lewis, and seeing those kind of links between the mainland and St Kilda has been quite interesting. The last time I saw St Kilda was about 2 weeks ago, just before I moved from the island back down to the Central Belt, and it's from Airduig. which is a former Cold War listening station on the west coast of Lewis. It has a Faye Godwin link. She photographed it about 20 years ago as they were kind of clearing the site. They still haven't entirely cleared it, so there's still some Cold War archaeology, modern archaeology there.
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, I feel it feels strange saying Cold War archaeology, but yes.
Yeah, and it would be, we are starting to think about how we legally protect and look after these things, but no one actually knows how to look after poorly made concrete. So there's kind of a challenge about legally protecting some of these structures when we have absolutely no idea how to look after them. And one example in St Kilda is you might have seen the munitions store. So there's a World War II naval gun that was erected on the island following a raid by a U-boat. And they also built a munitions store into the hill, which is made of classic World War I architecture, very quickly, poorly poured, poor quality concrete poured onto boards. So it's a good example, but it is literally falling to bits and there's no one that knows how to look after this. And generally, people are looking to see how they can get rid of 20th century concrete, not look after it. So that presents an interesting challenge, both for the Trust and actually across the country in terms of Cold War architecture that was not built to last.
Yeah, how you can protect these things. Yeah, there's a lot of objects on the island which I found quite fascinating to do with navigation, and then some tracking stations up on the island. Having spent some time down in Uist and Benbecula, and I mean at the moment operation, what's it called, Joint Warrior, a large kind of MOD exercise is on just now across Scotland. It's been going on every year, I believe, for the last couple of years. Yeah. We just moved down here, and I wasn't allowed. Sorry, Jess, to bring down the tail fin section of a British Army drone, which washed up on the beach near my home, for obvious reasons. But kind of seeing this kind of modern detritus and seeing the links between the mainland and the missile testing, which still goes on in Benbecula, and then being on St Kilda, where they actually carry out testing drills. Very last time I was on St Kilda, there was a flurry of activity with helicopters coming in with scientists. The diesel generator was going crazy, it was all happening. And they were firing rockets from the mainland towards the island. And that's quite often a thing that people don't think about. The book's called The Silent Islands, not just because some parts of the narrative are kind of left out in a kind of a romanticised approach, but it's also because it is literally a missile tracking station. It's a listening post. It's silent. It's waiting for the next rocket launch. And that's one thing that I've always been aware of. My father's regiment did drone testing during the Cold War, so it's something I was always quite curious about. And then to see it happening, and when you see the book, I've tried to give some examples of those objects, the remains there, and the things which are being used today, as well as the remains of Village Bay and the community that was there.
I think when I first met Alex, when you live and work on St Kilda, you pretty much meet 2 artists a day. And the National Trust and others sponsor a significant number of kind of art and music projects. And when you live anywhere for a long time, you do get used to it. I'm not going to deny that. So you become you don't appreciate the luck you have to be living there, and you become quite cynical. But I think probably the first time I met Alex and he said he was here working as an artist, my eyes probably rolled audibly, because you just meet so many, and the work tends to be very samey. People are, the military base is basically never in it. So when I started to speak to Alex and find that he was actually interested in the kind of vocabulary of the island as a modern living military community, my ears really started to prick up, because if you go on Wikipedia, and obviously as an academic and archaeologist, that's where I get all my information, it does say uninhabited islands, and that's I've titled my essay at the start of this book, The Inhabited Islands, because they actually have been permanently inhabited every day since 1957, apart from 2 weeks, which were a result of the storm that blew away the gym hall, which also flooded the generator, so the island had to be evacuated. So the military staff are there all year round. Myself and other National Trust staff and researchers and people doing kind of botanical research will generally be there from sort of March, April to October, November. The military staff do 4 weeks on, 4 weeks off. So in a sense you could say they're not a permanent population, but for some of them, for 15 of the last 30 years, they have lived on St Kilda, so if they're not inhabitants of there, they're not an inhabitant of anywhere. So I've always been interested in the idea of the islands as a living community, and after the tourist boats go, that's when that starts to come out. So that's why I think I was interested in Alex's work immediately as being something a bit different.
Well, thank you. When I first came to the islands, I really wanted to photograph the staff that lived and worked there, and there's some issues around that, of course, because of national security, I suppose.
Yes.
Yeah. But I was also really interested in National Trust staff. You were happy to be photographed, but you didn't end up in the book. I'm sorry.
There's literally pieces of wreckage in this book, but not me.
They're very handsome pieces of wreckage. It seems quite difficult to get permission to photograph anyone on the island, anyone who's doing the sheep research there, anyone who's working for the National Trust. The National Trust were very helpful to me when I put the book together, but I never got responses really on if I could photograph people. And Kinetic, obviously the MOD arm's length organisation, they would never get back to me for obvious reasons, So there's actually an absence of people in this. So in a strange way, I'm perpetuating the myth that no one lives there.
Yeah. But the interesting thing is that probably the reason you wouldn't get a response is just because you get such a preponderance of requests for stuff.
I imagine, yeah.
And it's quite ironic. So people will quite often say to you, like, how did you stand the isolation? But it's a bit like going up to someone who works in Disneyland and saying, how do you stand the quiet and isolation here? You're so sort of bombarded by people who are interested in the island, and you can only really respond to so many of them when you've also got a job to do.
Imagine, yes. I would love to have seen the side of the island that you saw, the large flat screen TVs, within people's homes, and the Puff Inn, which is now closed. That's the pub on the island, which is now closed to the public, I think, because
it's been closed to the public for a number of years. Technically and de facto for a slightly less long time, but it's actually an MOD canteen which for a long time operated illegally as a pub.
Oh, right. Okay.
And belatedly the staff supplemented their wages significantly.
Oh, right. Okay.
By buying a drink at cost price from somewhere in the US.
This is being recorded.
Allegedly,
yes, we can't prove that. Yeah.
But there's a surprising amount of mundanity to the island. For example, the old manse which the National Trust staff live in, which is where the minister lived, which is an 1830s building, requires an HMO licence because there's 3 people who are not related living in it. So council inspector comes over every couple of years to check the carbon monoxide detector and all that kind of stuff. We also have recycling is unbelievably strict, and there is a council bin lorry which comes over in a landing craft periodically to collect the recycling, because it is actually within the Western Isles Council's jurisdiction. And to me that's one of the most important things about the island, that it's not a tourist destination, it's a living, working community, and it is treated as such in that sense. But aside from all that kind of mundanity and hangovers and spreadsheets and all that sort of stuff that take up much of your time when you work there, you do still occasionally get moments where you sort of forget that and do still appreciate the place even after 3 years.
Last thing, I know we maybe sound slightly cynical, but when you go there, and as many of you have, it's incredible. I mean, it's sailing around Borray, for example, or the Stacks. I mean, I don't think there's anything really like that experience. It's like something out of I'm going to say Tolkien-esque because that's our kind of standard reference for anything amazing. But no, it's quite gothic. It's quite, and Village Bay itself is incredible just for the variety, that's there. And I mean, and that juxtaposition of the military base with the ruins there is just, that tension is quite bizarre.
It's also enormously Hebridean as well, because the story of St Kilda is really the story of the rest of the Hebrides, and it's archaeology plays that out from the very first evidence. On St Kilda we see people living exactly as everyone else did in the Western Isles, and it being a place that's very connected and culturally continuous with the Western Isles. So we see on St Kilda what happened everywhere else is that a culture of crofting has been replaced by a culture of tourism and Ministry of Defence work. So in that sense the biography of St Kilda is exactly that of the Eusts or Barra or Paris. And I think that's interesting that there is that continuity, strong continuity.
Yeah, I think they're going to build a gin distillery there next. I think it's the only Scottish island without one. Please, no one take that idea and run with it. But yeah, it's some of those issues in terms of the links with the rest of the Outer Hebrides that I was quite interested in. Even the kind of demographic there as well. I think a lot of people who are the service staff in St Kilda are Hebrideans.
Yes, lots of them are first language Gaelic speakers, and so when we had a leak in our roof, and two of the MOD engineers kindly had a look at it, they were discussing it, probably cursing it in Gaelic, although
Yes.
not know, are potentially talking about me.
That's just paranoia, I think.
Yeah.
But a lot of the staff from the National Trust are from all over the country, so it's quite kind of cosmopolitan, I suppose, in a way, which is.
Yeah, I think there are tensions, because if anyone are the natives, it's the MOD. I mean, we are, although I spent the best part of 3 years there, you are the summer visitors. You know,
Yes.
you're not there for the worst times in the winter, so I think there can be a bit of tension there. And researchers tend to be from, well, if you're doing a PhD at Cambridge, you're likely to be from a certain background, as opposed to sort of working class community people who work in the base. And one of the best things about almost everyone who sort of works there for the MOD are generally from the west of Scotland. There's some from Glasgow. There's one guy who actually lives on Malta because he does his 4 weeks on St Kilda. Then he just flies and lives in Malta, because why wouldn't you?
That sounds. Yeah, that's actually why we hit it off at first, because I arrived on the island, and you're from North Ayrshire. I'm also from North Ayrshire. We knew a lot of people in common. That's just not expecting someone from West Kilbride to greet me off the boat. Yeah.
So the puff in on Old Firm Night was very familiar to me, actually. And I think
You've written about that.
for me, the puff in felt like a pub in Ardrossan, where I'm from, and it probably about the same
from
price.
Ardrossan?
Yeah, even worse. Probably about the same price a pint, actually.
Yeah.
In Ardrossan, yeah, you can still get a pint for $1.40.
Wow.
So to go into a bit of a dusty, worn old men's pub that was full of very sexist jokes and sectarianism was like a weird homecoming. But you can imagine for a lot of visitors, because you need a lot of money to go to St Kilda.
Yeah.
The National Trust doesn't charge people to land because it doesn't want to add to that burden, and I hope that would never change. But that does mean that people who arrive tend to come from a certain background, so there's almost a weird class tension thing going on.
It was interesting going out there on the boat, because you'd have, I remember going out, I think the first time there's some, I can say this because I'm half German, but there's some Germans who came out with me, and they were really emotional. Like coming into Village Bay, they were visibly quite moved, you know, and I found that fascinating. I photographed them, of course, you know. But it was interesting to see that kind of connection, and this, when I've been living on Lewis and Harris, seeing this kind of very emotive, very, I can't really describe it. It's just a strong draw, and seeing that in the faces of people as they arrived there was...
It's interesting to do that every day. I felt like a sort of backwards undertaker. So an undertaker only sees people on like the worst day of their life, and I was basically only meeting people on the best day of their life, and it's quite a bizarre thing to experience every day. And it's weirdly, as someone who's quite cynical and doesn't like people already before I went to work in St Kilda, it's weirdly not waiting to see. I would make a point of, partly for procrastination, but going down to the jetty when the boats would arrive, because actually it's quite something to see 30 people step off a step or fall up a step as usual, because people trip on the steps every day because they just are like that. And it's kind of amazing to actually see like 30 or 40 people having the best day of their life, and it's very heartwarming sort of privilege to sort of bask in that, and then you have to go back to your spreadsheets. But
it's that kind of like community thing on the boat. As people came back, everyone, as I'm sure many of you experienced, saying, it's been fantastic seeing this. It's just a lovely kind of a vibe to kind of have. And then I come back and then edit the pictures and, you know, try to remove that and try to be kind of more objective about what I was looking at. But yeah, it's that emotional thing is quite powerful, you know.
Oh yeah.
I remember John McLeod, the artist, he was on St Kilda when Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt, now no longer together, they visited, because I think they hired out you were there actually at that time as well.
No, I got Lorraine Kelly, but
Lorraine Kelly.
Jolie, but I know which one I can't.
All right. But you have these cruise ships coming in, and I just wonder what that dynamic is like with them all coming into. I mean, there's a gift shop in Village Bay, which I found incredible. You know.
Yeah, and an extremely profitable one. It's not actually run by the trust; it's run by St Kilda Club, who are kind of friends of organisation who do an enormous amount of work to support the island. Actually, but yeah, we do get. They do get cruise ships regularly. Most of the cruise ships take about 80 odd people, and they tend to be sort of very sporty, retired Scandinavians who sort of think nothing of going straight up the hill, you know. But we do get some bigger cruise ships. So the National Trust runs its own cruise annually, and that's the biggest one we get by miles, and that can be sort of almost 500 people.
Oh wow!
So the shop is more cupboard-like than shop-esque.
Yes, that's true.
So that day when the Natural Trust cruise arrives, which is only one day, takes a week to prepare for.
All right.
So that's a bit of a shocker. But actually, if you go today on a day when there's not a cruise ship, but a nice day, you'd probably be about the same amount of people in Village Bay as there would have been historically. So maybe about 120.
All right.
So actually, today you get a sense of the hustle and bustle. People probably go and feel perhaps aggrieved that they're not there on their own, there's no silence, but actually the hustle and bustle and the wear on the streets probably exactly like it was when the islands were
I find
in
that
use.
hill walking, for example, in Scotland, people get very upset, and I've been known to do it as well when you're walking through a valley and there's a large amount of people there, and then you realise that this idea of walking through landscapes alone is a very contemporary idea, and there's a reason those landscapes are empty in a lot of cases. So yes, it has that strange tension. The seas around St Kilda are UNESCO Heritage Site, aren't they? They must be.
The World Heritage Site extends partly
out
into the sea,
okay.
and they have their own legal designations as well.
So there must be quite a tension there between those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest tensions is actually with the climbing community, because I think, now I wouldn't quote me on this, but I think there's three Corbetts or Marilyns, I can't remember which, on St Kilda.
Yeah.
One of them is Stackley, which is notoriously difficult to climb and involves jumping from a boat and literally just grabbing onto the cliff and then starting your ascent. So I think it's the Corbetts. There are hundreds and hundreds, maybe even thousands of them, and for a few years there was people who'd done every single one apart from the three on St Kilda. So obviously they were quite keen to be the first person to do it. But the difficulty is that obviously one of the reasons why St Kilda is a natural World Heritage Site is for seabird populations, and they are obviously extremely sensitive. So you can't. It's illegal because disturbing these seabirds is illegal. So you can't actually climb these in the seabird season. But once the seabirds leave, you're into November, and that brings its own challenges. So that can be very difficult because it's very difficult for the climbing community, but.
Well, that's what I found over the last couple of years. Being on Harris, I've bumped into a lot of groups which come up through the islands, and one of them is a group that collects islands. They've done their Munros, they've done their Corbetts, so they want to now collect all the islands of the UK, and they'll go to any lengths to do it. A lot of oil industry people, I find, and they've invited me to join them to go out to Stackley, for example, or onto Borray. And I've tried to get onto Borray 3 times now, and it's just not been possible. And Stackley was the same, because you have this huge amount of growth, and with the swell of the sea, it's almost impossible to get there. So those archaeologists that have been out there, I'm very jealous. Did you ever make it out to Borray?
No, well, I'm afraid of heights, which I didn't actually find out until I got the job working in St Kilda. And it was definitely significantly worse by the end of it.
With the high sea cliffs in the UK.
Yeah. No, I got out in a boat with some climbers to get around Borray and watch them land, and that was enough to put me off.
Wow.
The other big tension actually is, and I can say this because I no longer work for the National Trust, is that it's the UK's only dual World Heritage Site, so designated for its natural culture and its human culture, its history, and there's only something like 32 of those in the world, so it's a very, very unusual designation, and in theory it should be possible to manage the two in harmony, and part of the dual designation is about how people live with their environment, but there's some real difficulties in St Kilda because sort of botanically, Hurta, the main island that people visit, is a desert, because the soy sheep that you'll have seen if you went are not native to Hurta, they were not there. When the St Kildans farmed, they had modern breeds of sheep that were kept corralled and managed. The soy sheep were brought from the island of Soy in 1932 and put on Hurta as a kind of experiment. So they're obviously enormously culturally significant, and they have enormous scientific significance as well, and there's a project that's been studying them for many years, which is doing research into genomics and cures for cancer and amazing stuff. But those sheep, which are culturally significant, have essentially destroyed the biodiversity of St Kilda. So there's a real challenge in that by getting rid of those, you would get rid of one of the things that's most iconic about the island, that people most appreciate, that appear on all the postcards, and you would put an end to a long-running and very highly significant research project. But by keeping them, we're basically the biodiversity of the islands has really vanished, and they're having an enormous impact on the archaeology of the islands as well. So it's quite an intractable problem.
I did find that, there's sheep on pretty much every cleat and I found that quite challenging.
Yeah.
Afraid the only sheep in the book is the skull of one. I'm not a huge fan of sheep, unfortunately. So.
It's surprising how many tourists are stopped at the jetty with a sheep skull in their bag, or a bag full of rocks on another.
Bag full of
occasion.
rocks, yeah. Wow.
But that's just one example of the difficulty of managing a site like this, and I think the St Kildans also came across this problem. So part of the research I did for my PhD is about seabird filling on St Kilda, the hunting of seabirds for their meat, feathers, eggs, oil and other products. And you can see that the rules governing harvesting seabirds, which were incredibly strict, changed very, very frequently because the St Kildans were having a major impact on the seabird populations. Mm-hmm. So you see for certain periods that certain species of birds are actually not allowed to be hunted at all, their eggs are not allowed to be taken, but then 20 years later that seems to have changed, and you see things like the stack, which is in the middle of the bay in Harta. It was the people the oarsmen of the boat that went there had a share each of the birds in one particular period, but 10 years later it was spread out depending on how much land you had in your croft. So they were having difficulties with their impact on the environment. I think people probably perceive that they are living as a kind of Aboriginal population in harmony with the environment, but it's not really the case at all. And they were also having difficulty with soil quality because of the heavy manuring that they were actually undertaking. So it's not a modern thing that the natural and cultural of St Kilda is kind of intractable. That's always been part of the challenge of living in the islands.
So there's been some strange kind of idealism about the community that lived there, in terms of, that it was kind of cut off for reasons to do with medical, and also I'll not go into some of the other reasons, but that is somewhat frozen in time. It's ossified. It's as if it were, it could have continued on in some shape or form. Yeah,
it's perceived to be very unchanging. Which is not really the case. So some of the research I've done around the year 1814, mysteriously the island's entire rent is paid in feathers, and it's literally almost 20 tons of feathers. So imagine what a ton of feathers looks like if you can. Obviously they were very tightly baled, but the reason for this is the Napoleonic Wars, which create a real market for fulmar feathers, which are immune to lice. So actually what you're seeing on St Kilda is the industrial harvesting of a basically industrial product for an international market driven by a global war. And actually when you look at St Kilda's history, that's quite typical.
We see that in Harris as well. They were, is it potash? They were
for
kelping. Yeah. So Napoleonic Wars created this huge market, and then when that conflict ended, it kind of
yes, and they went back to not paying in feathers anymore. Yeah. And it's interesting because the same time, that 1814, when you get that figure, there was someone out who tried to take a record of how many birds they had taken in a single season. And the numbers are quite accurate, and it looks like they took something like 18,000 puffins in a single season, almost 10,000 gannets. If you put together all the birds, it's something like 36,000. So what traditionally people have done is just divide that number by the number of people in the island and said, oh, they must have ate 4 birds a day.
Yeah, okay.
And so you get what you're actually seeing is this industrial byproduct farming, and also the oil, which was important kind of medicine. So the idea that these people are relying on seabirds to subsist is actually probably not correct. You see sort of seabird hunting across all of northwest Europe, all over Scotland, and including South Scotland and the north of England. When St Kilda, you see this industrial kind of scale of harvesting, which again is not what people imagine. So I think people think that the landscape of the cottages and the street on St Kilda is a kind of quite a natural landscape, as opposed to the MOD landscape, which is kind of ugly and industrial and workaday. But actually the enclosures of St Kilda are about the management of stock, either about the management of animals which were being exported. So I don't see that as a strong distinction, that they are both evidence of a working landscape of people whose primary concern was making a buck, feeding their families.
I thought we might take some questions perhaps, if people want to learn more about the book, or if they want to learn more about Kevin's experience.
I think you said, Kevin, that after the island had its natural population removed, 1930, that the belongings left behind were then taken away from the dwellings. The archive footage I've seen, people seem to be very lightly laden. I didn't see any items of furniture being tripped out, barely a suitcase, so presumably a lot was left.
Yes, yeah, it was.
What was that and what became of it?
Most of it was burnt
Yep.
because the islands were bought by the Marquis of Bute in 1932 and ran as a kind of private nature reserve until the Trust took them over in 57. So when the Trust first took the islands over, it was the same time that the military base was being built, and the first volunteer work parties actually went out in the summer where the base was being built. They came across these buildings which were falling to bits, which had loads of rotten furniture, which was less than 30 years old. They were perceived to look untidy, so they had some nice big bonfires really through the 50s and 60s. But if you think about it, if you were to buy a 30-year-old council house, you wouldn't put a red rope around the avocado bathroom suite. Because, in fact, the avocado bathroom suite now is more than 30 years ago, isn't it? So the objects in these houses were not old or unusual. They were just rubbish. They were perceived to be rubbish, and so most of it was burned to create the more sort of clean and sterile appearance you see now of kind of bare stone. Although you can see there's still bits of wooden floor in places.
I can say I worked out in Lanter up in Stornoway until about a week ago, and in the process of working there, I'd worked with the museum. And they've got a large collection of objects which are from the houses.
Yes, so some salvage objects that are now in the museum in Ellen and Glasgow University Museum and elsewhere. In fact, there are about 8 museums that have got St Kilda objects.
Right. Just yesterday, I was in Fife and went into Falkland, an old antique shop there, crammed with a great variety of goods, including a very large dresser in a very black wood of extraordinary carving. And the owner of the shop said this came from St Kilda. Would you take that with a pinch of salt?
Yes. Absolutely, yeah. There's no, as far as I'm aware, there's nothing on that scale that has left islands apart from, unless one of the St Kildans took it with them, but they did take a small amount of furniture.
Well, it's like that whole story, the album which came out a couple of years ago, that kind of maudlin elevator music album. Hopefully no one was involved with it. The Lost Songs of St Kilda. The story about the piano. I mean, they've tried to track down the piano, but the songs which were, transcribed to someone who then played them in an old folks home and then they were kept. There seems to be some on kind of examination of that. Some people have challenged, the kind of veracity or where these songs came from. Herta, Bore, the names of the songs. And if you read the articles, including like with Sir James Macmillan, they say, so do you think it's true, that where these songs came from? They went, well, it doesn't really matter, it's kind of a nice story. Yeah. And that's kind of the story of St Kilda, I think, is this kind of romanticised.
Well, the really interesting thing about that is that this was a very popular album. I don't want to speak to the sort of veracity of it, I don't really know enough, but very, very popular album, did really well, and I think it got into like top 10.
Yeah, classics. It was really, really popular.
But the weird thing is, there is publicly available free recordings on the internet of actual St Kildans singing actual songs from St Kilda. Yeah. And this is sort of classic St Kilda. People don't actually really want the reality. They want something that's packaged up in a particular way, which is mysterious.
If you want to support,
so you sort of no, don't want the facts. Where's the mystery?
Well, if you want that kind of cleanse St Kilda, go down that route. But if you want to really support St Kildan heritage, donate to Tobar and Dochas, which looks after all that heritage.
Yes, and that's where it's publicly available as well
for free.
Yes,
So if you want to, and that's some amazing things on there. The sheer amount of songs around Ireland. Worked with Mary Smith, a very well-known Gaelic singer on the island, and she's this repository of knowledge on St Kildan song, and it's people like her who are really keeping it alive. And she'd be the first person to say use that resource. So yeah. Does anyone else have any questions?
Yeah. Oh. What do you think the future holds for St Kilda?
I think change. The story of St Kilda is one of change, and landscapes aren't static, and it's impossible and possibly expensive to make them. So I think the fact that the military base at the moment is being replaced is very good news for the continuity of the current situation in St Kilda, because the National Trust could not be there if the military weren't there, and it would cease to operate as a tourist destination really. And before the MOD presence between 1932 and 1957, lots of people actually did arrive and cause a lot of damage, steal quite a lot of objects, shoot sheep, that sort of stuff. So I think if the MOD weren't there, the Trust wouldn't be able to be there, and it would quickly fall apart and be subject to, I think you would probably get squatting, I suspect, by sort of old/mad people. But I think that the current situation of the MOD National Trust partnership looks strong because of base rebuild, and there's also a new 10-year management plan being signed for the islands. Historic Environment Scotland Fund part funds on the conservation work. So I think if you go in 10 years' time, you will not see an enormous difference apart from the new military base. However, that won't last forever. I think the MOD presence on the Western Isles will not last forever.
Yeah.
It's increasingly becoming automated. There's been several threats of that. So I think it's an uncertain future. The only certainty really is change, but that's a normal part of St Kilda, and it's already been through that.
Well, if there's one thing which is quite strong, it's the UK arms industry. So as long as we continue to produce weapons, hopefully there'll be a presence there. So it's
and I think it makes work like Alex's more important because he's documented the process of change on the islands, which is continuous. A lot of people when they arrive think that the buildings are, as I say, unchanged since 1930, but it's me that put them back up when they fall down. So they are constantly changing, and actually it's literally one of the most highly photographed landscapes in the world. And the National Trust use photographs as a reference to rebuild walls. So if a wall collapses, we have a photograph of it and we put the stones back stone for stone exactly in the order they were. So our reference set of photographs just for Village Bay is over 60,000 photographs in it, and it's an enormous database. So there will be a record of change, and the Trust considers its role as managing change because it's not possible to keep things the same.
I think I've been asked to donate the pictures to the Trust, for that reason. So yeah, it's great to have that. In terms of tourism, I think, is it 1 in 3 boats gets out there because of the weather? So
the numbers have not went up enormously in the past 6 or 7 years, and I think they probably have hit a natural limit in terms of cost is the big problem for people getting there.
I do wonder now, they're planning to build a kind of cruise ship terminal in Stornoway, and if this does come to pass, I do wonder if that will increase more. And what's this other? I think I was reading recently if the northern ice caps melt, they'll have this new route over the top of the world. So the Isle of Lewis will be perfectly positioned for more mass tourism. So that's quite a dire warning, but yeah, it's an interesting time for St Kilda.
I just wanted to ask a few questions about pictures.
Mm-hmm.
Have you got favourites? Were there favourite places to go to, or how did you sort of work out what to photograph?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. The first time I went there, I had this idea in mind that I will not photograph Village Bay because I want to be a contrarian, which is great for a couple of minutes but gets kind of old very quickly, and it doesn't really tell the full story. So on repeat visits, I really enjoyed photographing, believe it or not, the roads above Village Bay. I've been working with a Japanese photographer called Takeshi Shikama, who has this very pared down, very minimalist style. So the days when the fog rolled in over Village Bay, I was like, this is fantastic. I'm going to have these very minimal landscapes to work with. So in the book, my favourite image is of a road going into the mist. But in terms of cleats, when I first presented the book to Gavin, I think you said there was 1 or 2 too many cleats in there. It could have almost been, how many cleats are on St Kilda?
Around 1,200 on Harta and 200 on the other islands put together.
So I think I photographed all of them. So I've tried to kind of cut down the cleat approach, but just going around the island, I'd have other photographers in mind. Robin Galanders, who's sitting in front of me. One of the images, his actual approach to black and white photography has been really influential to me. So he won't agree, but something like these gravestones, for example, when I was there, I was actually thinking of you in terms of the actual approach. So
You're just seeing that.
I'm just saying that if there's another photographer sitting there, No, there's images. The kind of more minimal ones were more interesting to me. Village Bay itself is quite busy. I was using Faye Godwin's camera for a lot of it, but I was trying not to channel kind of Faye Godwin, as it were. I thought that'd be sort of cheap, if that makes sense. So instead, the book does have the Faye Godwin. It'd be cheap. If the book has one link to Faye Godwin, there's a great film which came out about her recently called Don't Fence Me In, and she looked at. She talks about her work as a photographer, and she said the one thing she wanted to do was to create small, affordable books which aren't big coffee table books, and that they'd be something you'd actually carry around and look at. So that's, in terms of other photographers, that's the main thing. Yeah, that's the image there that I quite like. So.
My flat's too wee for a coffee table as well, so I'm quite
You're
happy.
welcome. You're welcome. If anyone has a really big flat and wants a bigger version, we can. But yeah, that's probably one of my favourites in the book.
And you didn't do any wet plate collodion on St Kilda?
No, I kind of thought of taking wet plate. So I also did this antique process wet plate collodion, which involves silver nitrate and cyanide and glass plates. And I was really interested in the early approach to photography in the island with people like George Washington Wilson. But I thought in the end that'd be too arduous to take it out there. All the chemistry, I can carry that around with me on my back, and I developed the images in the field. But given the chemicals and the uncertainty of the weather on the island, I just thought it's not worth it, and it didn't fit the project. I think if you use an old photographic process, it can quickly become a gimmick, and I really didn't want to trivialize what was there by just using a photographic process. So if you want the collodion look in the pictures, there's a fantastic app on the iPhone, and you can just do it that way.